Welcome everyone. Thanks for joining us on this video. I'm Graham Akers from Britech Systems in Vancouver. Gordon?
And I'm Gordon Hegfield from HCL Software. Heiko?
Michael Voigt from Harmolite Software in Halifax. And today we have the great pleasure to have Gordon with us again, because in the latest AppDevPack release 1.0.8, there have been some significant changes in the way that you can work with OAuth authentication against APIs that the Domino server itself provides. And Gordon will give us a little bit more insight than we had in the first What's New video. So Gordon, over to you and just take it away.
Okay, great. I'm going to share my screen. All right, so OAuth support for Domino applications. So as Heiko explained, this essentially allows you to implement OAuth access to your existing Domino hosted REST APIs without any code changes. So if I give a scenario, usage scenario might look like this, where you've got a React application, possibly using things from the AppDevPack, DominoDB API or whatever. And you also want to use some REST APIs that are hosted on the Domino server. The convenient way to do that and not have to use other kinds of credentials would be to use an access token, an OAuth 2 access token. So in this scenario, you'd have your React application. It's set up to use the IAM service for authentication and do the OAuth flows. And in this new scenario, you can essentially set up some configuration that allows your REST application that's running on the Domino server to now accept that access token and perform various operations based on the scopes, the OAuth scopes that are presented in the token. So we'll get into more detail on what that actually means when I demonstrate some of this later on. So we'll just move down here to what we're going to talk about. So a couple of things we're going to talk about first is the IAM service and the adpconfig.nsf dependency that now exists in order to use this feature. I'm going to describe what resource definitions are and details about the configuration and things you need to know there. And then I'm going to go through a step-by-step example to configure a simple application to do this. Now, this is essentially topology that exists with this new feature. So previously, the IAM service using the DominoDB API would fetch data out of the IAM store and update data in the IAM store using the Proton service. And now, with this new feature, we will also be pulling data from adpconfig.nsf. And the reason we're doing that is because on the Domino server, there's something called the OAuth the SAPI filter, which is an add-in that the HTTP server loads, and it needs to read configuration from adpconfig.nsf. And as well, the IAM service needs to read config from adpconfig.nsf. So these two things, these two components share this configuration. The IAM service only needs to read this configuration. So I'm going to dive into an example here right now, just to show you how to set this up. So if you start up the IAM service after you've just updated to 1.0.8, you'll see an error message on the screen on the console that says it doesn't have access to adpconfig.nsf, and it says polling disabled. So if you don't want this feature, you can just ignore that. It's not going to keep filling the logs with error message. It's going to say, I don't have access. You don't want the feature, and that's it. It won't bother you again. But in our case, of course, we want the feature. So I wanted to just show the best practice for setting this up. So actually, I want to get rid of that. And we're going to come up here and we're going to open up my dev server, adpconfig.nsf. The other thing, of course, is as part of your upgrade process, you do need to update the design of the adpconfig template. And there's instructions in the doc how to do that. So here you can see the new template has a new section called OAuth 2. And there's nothing here at the moment because we're going to add something. But the first thing you need to know is in the access control settings, here we need to add a user with read access. So the best thing to do is to actually go and locate your IAM store database. Oops, I misspelled it on purpose. And if you go to the access control, the user that I'd recommend using here is the same one that the IAM service uses to access the IAM store database. So in that case, it's the IAM client. In my case, it's the IAM client user here. So I'm just going to copy that. And then I'll go over here and I'll add this in. Now here, you don't need to give anything but reader access. And I uncheck these two things. It doesn't need to write or replicate or copy documents. It doesn't do anything except read. So with that, I should be able to go over here and restart the IAM service. And here you can see now polling enabled at, in this case, interval 1 minute. So the default is 5 minutes. But this tells you that everything is set up to work now between the IAM service and adpconfig. So now that we're all set up, I'm going to go look at a sample REST API that I've created. This is actually one I use in my test cases. That's just essentially does what I call a repeater or like an echo, which basically allows me to verify that the user context that I expect, in other words, the one that's associated with the OAuth token, is actually passed in to the REST API through the disapi filter. And the other thing this does is this happens to be what I call a DAS extension, and I got this from the OpenNTF sample code. But essentially what it also allows you to do is specify a database prefixed on the URL, which then causes this, inside the code here, causes this get user database to essentially have that database available to you. So you don't have to open a database in your code. It's done for you if the path is prefixed a certain way. And we'll see why that's important in a minute. So I'm going to try to use this sample first, and we'll see what happens. So here I have, this is the authorization code flow sample that you're probably familiar with if you've done any experimentation with the IAM service. And in this case, I have this, the API, or I'm sorry, the URL I want to use here is the DAS test repeater URL. So if I try this right now, I'm going to get essentially an error message back. This is the error message that comes back with session-based login enabled. And you can see why. If you look here, you'll see that I don't have, the scopes I have are for the calendar API. I don't have any scopes for anything else. And so it's kind of, this request is going to get rejected because the disapi filter says you don't have the right scopes. So now what we want to do is go through the steps required to get this to work. So the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to come over here and I'm going to add a resource configuration. So the first thing you have to decide is what servers this configuration applies to. The adpconfig database can be located on multiple servers that replicate. So if you have a cluster, for instance, you could do this configuration on one server and have it apply to all the servers that are selected here. So in this case, I'm just going to select one server. And then just any kind of description is this will surface. This description, by the way, surfaces over in the IM service. So that's where this might be useful to have something that you can easily identify. So here on the path, I'm going to say API DAS test. And the thing about this path, these paths are, there's a couple of things. One is the way this matching works is these slashes are considered delimiters, and everything inside the delimiters is a whole string match. And what I mean by that is, if I were to enter this and API food, for instance, don't both match a substring of API/APA/food. So it does essentially what I call a whole string, whole word match inside the URL components. This isn't like a substring match. And some people that I showed this to earlier on were assuming something different was happening here. So I'm going to, in this case, give what is essentially the root URI of my application. So it has other URI components that you can ask that are farther down, but you don't have to specify those. The other thing is once you specify a path here, I can't go make another configuration that looks like this, right? Because it's once you claim this namespace, it's claimed by a single configuration. And likewise, if I went and defined a configuration that looks like this, I can't then go create a new configuration that looks like this, because someone has basically claimed that namespace already. This checkbox here, you need if your REST API is one that supports this notion of accepting a path prefix. So if your API can do something like this, then you don't have to specify names.nsf here. You can just check the global checkbox, and then any database prefix that's supplied to the HTTP service will match. So that's just some detail about this configuration that folks probably wouldn't be aware of, and it's a bit much to put in all the documentation. So now we're going to come down to adding scopes. So scopes are essentially an OAuth 2 concept that I'm going to say they represent permissions, and they usually represent subsets of things that are allowed against an API. But in this case, we're gonna map scopes to the standard HTTP methods. So I'm going to show you how that works. So I'm going to create a new one called DAS-test.read, and I do recommend prefixing your scope names with the name of the API because it's just easier to keep track of, because these scopes surface in a bunch of different places. So when I do this, Now here, I'm going to decide what HTTP methods I want to allow on this scope. So when the scope is presented, the disapi filter on the HTTP server will decide whether or not you're allowed to do that action. So in this case, I'm going to select these two because they're essentially read operations. And then here, I'm going to give a label. I'm going to say, here I'll give a description. So the thing about these labels and this description is that they surface in a couple of different places. They surface in the IAM Service Administration UI, and they also surface on the consent screen that's displayed whenever an end user using an application is redirected over to the IAM service to ask for permission to access some service. So that's why these are important to get right, and just to sort of be aware of the fact that they're going to be surfaced to end users.
Good question, Gordon.
Yes.
As I've been dealing with this last week for a customer, we had to translate these messages that appear, especially in the consent windows, to different languages. Is there a concept for that? I'm sure there's another concept of translations right now, but are you working on something like this?
Yeah, it's one of these things that needs to be surfaced in all of the components, and it's just not right now. So your best bet at this point would be, if you can, to somehow do something here that covers maybe different languages, although that may end up being too long. But it is definitely something that we know we need to deal with in the future.
Okay.
So I'm actually going to go and add two more scopes here while I'm here, because it'll be useful later. So this is for read. Now I'm going to go and add. You can go here and you can add two more. And I think I'll leave the delete out for now. That should be good. So now, if I go back here, you come in read only, you see a nice little display. And then also, there's this JSON source that is essentially here. This is essentially what, internally the service sees, but this can be handy to know. Just in general, it's probably a handy thing to pass to support too, if you end up with some kind of issue where you need to debug something.
Is there a way to inline edit that JSON? Because it looks to me like with the descriptions, you've got the Lang default, so you could always put in there, Lang German.
Mm-hmm. Not at this time. No, there's no way to do it. There's no way to edit inline.
Okay.
So now the question is, what happens on the IAM service? And so if I go over here, it's probably going to want me to log in again. So I didn't show this to begin with, but a new resource provider showed up under the resource providers collection. So here you can see this is the resource from the resource definition. I just added a resource provider gets created over on the IAM service side, and you can see there's my description, and you'll notice that the edit button's grayed out. That's because these are considered read only. Everything, all management of these particular resource providers are done from the adpconfig database. So let's go and look at this now. So here you'll notice once again, edit's grayed out, delete's grayed out. And we've added a little table here that shows the scopes definitions that we did over in ADP config. So the label, the description, and the scope. And one thing I want to point out, and I've called this out in the doc several places, there's a prefix on the scope that it's just necessary to make these things work in the IAM service, which is this ADP config prefix. So when you get to using these scopes in your applications, like in your application config, for instance, you want to make sure you come to the IAM service to grab the relevant scopes for your configuration and not take them from ADP config database. So that you come here, this is your source now for anything related to OAuth configuration in terms of, and in terms of essentially having the IAM service authenticate your requests. The other places services now is if I go to an application config. So remember that we tried to use the DAS test API a minute ago and it didn't work. It was rejected. So here we have the application configuration for that authorization code sample. So if I go in and edit it, now what I should have is, in addition to the built-in scopes, you can see now I have read DAS test data and it says allow this application. So there's my label again, right? And then same with the label and description, they show up here. So now I'm just going to take this one for now and click the save button. And if we go back and look, it should be there, and there it is, which is good. Now I happen to have the authorization code flow app running. So what I'm going to do is go over here back to my resource provider. We're going to grab that scope, the read scope.
I have to complete it right. I forgot.
And over here now, this is if you've used this authorization code flow sample. This is the configuration you do to basically tell it what scopes to ask for. So I'm going to just add the scope in here, and this list is a space separated list. Don't put commas and things in here because it won't work. So I've added that scope. I've got to save it. Don't forget to restart it. So now I'm going to go back over here and I got to do a new window. Go in and log in as user. So now first thing you'll notice is, once again, here's my description showing up in the consent form. Right. So this is, as I was saying, this is why those descriptions are worded the way they are, is because when you get over to this screen, you basically, at least in my opinion, you want to be specific about what you're asking, and what you're really asking is that this particular application be able to access some data on your behalf. So that's why I worded it this way. It's sort of just a convention I have. So I'm going to log in as a test user here. And now we should see that the scopes have come through. And as you can see, if you look at the introspection result, you can see, yes, there is in fact a scope now called adpconfig.nsf read. And so down here, happens. Uh-oh, got an error. Well, and that's because I left out a configuration step that I wanted to highlight, and it's not one that I enjoy having to tell you about, but it's just a reality at this point. And that is that in order to do these, in order to allow the HTTP service and the DSAPI filter to introspect the OAuth token, it's necessary to have a separate set of OAuth credentials for the application. So this only has to be done when you first add a resource definition, and we'll certainly be doing some work to make this more seamless, but right now this is necessary. So actually what I like to do with these things is I like to use Notepad just to create my command for me. So I happen to know that my server runs in a partition, so I have to run from my data directory. So I'm going to do it like this. So I'm going to start with my OAuth config command, and then I'm going to gather what I need up to create my introspection credentials. And what I need is, first of all, the credentials need to be named the same as the resource. So that's the name of the resource. And then I need a resource provider ID. And I need the secret. And then lastly, I need a URI, the URI of the introspection API. And I thought I would take this opportunity to show one more thing that maybe folks weren't aware of, and that is that there is this well-known endpoint that shows you essentially all of the available endpoints on the IAM service, and it doesn't have to be authenticated to access. And this is true of any OpenID provider. You can see this from public services that use OpenID and OAuth. They will present this endpoint, which is .well-known and then OpenID-configuration. So you can try it against some well-known service providers, and you'll see that they return this very same info specific to their service. So the reason I show you this is because the last piece of information you need is the introspection endpoint. And so that, I'm just going to do a little search for introspection. And there's something called introspection endpoint here. And I'm just going to copy that because I won't have to type it. And I'm going to copy that over here. And we're going to go to the command line, not this one, this one. And as I said, I run a partition server, so my notesany is in my data directory. So this varies depending on how your server is set up. And so what I'm going to do here now, this is going to create credentials in the credential store that the DSAPI filter is going to use in order to be able to invoke this introspection API, this introspection endpoint, and validate the token that gets passed. So now the credentials are created successfully. So now what I expect is when we go back to the auth code flow sample, we should be able to introspect that access token. And we're going to see that the gas test sample should now work. So we're logged in. And there we have it. So what actually has worked here is what's happened is the token, this token was passed to the application to the HTTP server, and the DSAPI filter introspected the access token and saw that it has this scope, and that with this scope, it is permitted to do a get. And the basic proof you have here is that the username is set to the username that's in this notesDN claim of the access token. So let's try one other thing, which is, if you remember, I set the configuration to be global so that this should also match. So now if I do that, I should see DB path populated. And it is populated, so there you go. So you can then fill in the rest of the examples here. I mean, as essentially, if you want to do create, you have to go. I think I did one for create. You can prove that works as well. But I think this demonstrates the basic idea and should allow folks to basically get up and running with this stuff pretty quickly. Now, a couple of other things before we wrap up here is that all this configuration over here, adpconfig, is live. In other words, it will synchronize back over to the IAM service there's two different ways. One is that the IAM service polls in the background, and by default it polls every 5 minutes. But the other way it surfaces is anytime you go to the IAM service and you view some part of the UI that requires this data, it'll just refresh it in real time. So either way, changes you make in adpconfig will synchronize over to the IAM service. And the other thing is that the DSAPI filter also is monitoring adpconfig for these changes. So that's checking once a minute for changes. So you make a change here, you have to expect to wait a minute before they take effect. But essentially, you don't have to restart anything for any of this to work. And lastly, if you delete your configuration from here, from the adpconfig, it will be deleted from the IAM service. So if I delete this, and I go back over to IAM, yes, it's gone. So just be aware of that things will disappear over here if you delete them from the adpconfig database. But you can change most every attribute of the resource configuration, and it will synchronize itself over. If you change the name, if you change the URI, the URL, it will mean that you have to go and do that OAuth config step again. Because credentials are matched by the URI of or the path of the resource. So that's just something to be aware of. And the other thing is, if you delete resource configuration, you will have credentials hanging around in the credential store that you should delete. I mean, they're not going to be useful for anything because we just deleted the resource provider. Whenever you delete this resource configuration over here, we deleted the resource provider in IAM service. So you really can't use it, but that's just something to be aware of. A couple other things I just want to point out that I had in my slides.
For the resource configuration, would it be possible to have all the resource provider configurations in adpconfig, like for Proton and the OAuth DSAPI filter as well? Or should you create them manually in IAM?
You have to create those manually in IAM yet. Yeah. Yeah, they're kind of considered, especially the Proton ones, they're sort of considered something a little bit different than your standard HTTP resource provider. Mm-hmm. So yeah, those two are, if you want to use the calendar and FreeBusy APIs, you do it the old way. In fact, we won't even let you define them here because we have our own special scopes in the code we're looking for and things like that. So we don't even allow you to define those things. I did want to point out a couple of things. One is the patch method, which is just not supported. That's why it's not in the configuration. And this is a limitation with the core Domino disappy filter API that when it was developed, they never added the ability to look for patch methods. So I would have loved to give it to you, but I just can't. It will require a change to the disappy API in the core Domino server. So there is an SPR for it. But that's why that is missing. And the other thing is, if you're using site config, I don't know how many people use site config, but you have to remember to set up your sites to reference the disappy filter, enable the HTTP methods you want for your site. But the other thing about this config is basically global, so it's going to apply. It applies to the HTTP server right now. It doesn't apply to a site. So you notice when I did my config, I specified a server. So that's something we can look at as an enhancement for the future. But right now, that's just something to be aware of with site config. And I think that's all I have for today.
Excellent. The thing that I was thinking when you were talking about, you delete the configuration and or entry in ADP config and it's reflected immediately in the IAM server. Like that's a good thing, right? That's really important to understand from a security standpoint and how the Domino server is managing it. So thumbs up there. I thought that was great. Thank you.
Yeah. There's one other thing. I mean, the important thing I think from the security side of things is that the disappy filter itself is the sort of the gatekeeper of actual access, and it is always looking at that ADP config, once a minute, and when the server starts. I mean, if you needed something quicker than 1 minute, I suggest bouncing the HTTP service, on the Domino server console, and if there was some bad emergency that you needed to stop access that quicker than a minute, then you'd have to bounce the server. But generally, we're trying our best here to make sure that people don't have to constantly bounce and restart things when config changes.
Okay, well, that's a long one, so let's not stick around any longer. Thank you, everyone, for joining us on this video. All the standard YouTube reminders apply, but we appreciate your time, and we'll be bringing you more in the future. So thanks, and have a great day.